Great. So we have with us today a really sort of astounding panel, and a very diverse panel as well in terms of skill sets, experience, and where they've been and what they've done. So I'll just like to introduce each of them, and I see Sabelo is here, and welcome to Sabelo. Sabelo Sibanda is an entrepreneur at heart. He's founded a couple of companies, and he's got an investment for his companies, and he's always sort of questioning how to make Africa better through solutions that drive social impact. And that's really been sort of the driving force of why he's started companies and exited companies and started companies again. So that's Sabelo. We've also got Rowan Spazzoli, who is very much sort of educated in the impact investment space. He's a strategist, lecturer, and a consultant. He is really well sort of versed in impact investment, what it means. He's done a lot of research on the topic, and he actually consults to a couple of companies on that space as well. And then we have Colin Isles. So Colin Isles is a disruptive interventionist. He coaches a lot of senior leaders and gets a lot out of them. He helps leaders build sort of impact-led businesses and better organizations. He's got a long history of being sort of what we'd call as millennials and Gen Zs, an innovation catalyst, and really looks to guide leaders into the next sort of the next horizon of growth for their businesses. So it's an honor and a privilege to welcome all of you, and I look forward to a very engaging session. I would just like to then hand it over to the panelists quickly, just to say hi, and also just to, if I've missed anything, you guys want to sort of introduce anything else about yourselves, go ahead and do that. I'll give you guys just a couple of minutes collectively just to shed more light on yourselves. Let's start with Sabelo, and then Rowan, and then Colin, please.
Yeah, cool. Thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate the platform. Yes, as Zunaid said, my name is Sabelo. I'm the co-founder of Truse and Creditize, two data-driven startups. The first pivoted a number of times from mesh networking right through to predictive maintenance. So it's a field of machine learning that applies to heavy industry. So we work very closely. Actually, we partnered with one of the largest mining companies on the African continent, and that's going swimmingly. And the second company is a fintech that again leverages data to score with over 86% accuracy the ability of small and medium-sized businesses to repay loans using non-financial data and machine learning as well. So super keen to share some experiences and very specifically how to raise a bit of money for your startup.
Awesome. Thanks, Sabelo. How's it, everyone? I'm Rowan. I'm really excited to be here. I'm a 2017 BYM alumni. And honestly, the BYM conference itself and the people there changed my life in a lot of ways. I still work with so many of the BYM cohort from 2017. But yeah, just to tell you a little bit about myself. I sort of work along the whole value chain when it comes to startups and impact investing. My sort of core thing that I do is I lecture at the University of Cape Town in business strategy. I also work for the business school at the University of Cape Town, specifically the Bertha Center, and I'm doing some research with them on blended finance, on impact investing, and helping them administer funding for high impact student startups. I work a lot in the consulting space, and I've gotten the privilege to work on some really cool projects from impact investing to startups to general economic development work. My background is in economic development, and I'm just really excited to be on this panel and really excited to be here with all of you today. Thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone. Obviously, my name is Colin. I've got nothing to add really. I think Zunaid's intro was just Perfect. So looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, great. So without dwelling too much on Lerisha, she may join a bit later. So let's get straight into it then. I think one of the major things about BYM is that there are a lot of delegates who are wanting to start companies or have started companies. And we've seen impact investment, which is not really an asset class. It's sort of, an asset class and a lot of variations of types of finance that forms part of impact investment. But a lot of them are sort of looking to get investment into their companies and are looking to grow their companies. So we can start with Rowan. Rowan, can you give us a bit of context as to, what is impact in the context of impact investment, so that our delegation can get an appreciation for this sort of very airy term called impact, and get a bit of context on that.
Awesome. So impact investing is quite a broad field, and it's also quite a new field. And by broad, it can range from companies doing some CSR type work. So for example, I know there's some companies that do impact investing in the way that some of the profits they return get reinvested in impact driven projects, all the way along the line to having really, really complex types of impact investing, such as social impact bonds, which pay out when impact happens. So the spectrum of impact investing is quite wide, but it is also very, very new. So just in the space, in terms of what it means to have impact, there's a broad spectrum of areas where impact can be had, but a lot of the time in the space, we look at the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN as the kind of broad categories that we look at when it comes to impact. And from the startup side, specifically, if you're looking to be impactful in the space, it's important to understand that impact investing, as much as it is focused on impact, is still investing and needs to generate some sort of a return. So it's a very tricky area to play in, but it's a very exciting area because juggling the whole idea of impact, but also being able to generate that return and be sustainable is complex. So yeah, the space is very new. There's only about 10, 15 years worth of work that's been done in the area, but a lot of it's been built on previous work in the sort of impact space and in the investing space, and they sort of have come together a lot to build a really cool ecosystem. And there's a lot of companies, a lot of organizations, and a lot of support from governments that's happening. So it's a really exciting space to be in.
Great, thanks for that, Rowan. And then just also, so Rowan said that it's a fairly new space. It's a new sort of ideology that people have put behind investing. And what we've also seen over sort of many years is the traditional investment is always about generating a profit and not really caring about the environment, your employees, how creditors are treated, how the community is treated around you. Mining companies in South Africa, not bashing them, but there are a couple of instances where we can see how employees have been disregarded in our recent history. So that's sort of your traditional investment. And then socially responsible investing is, your traditional investment, but it's blended with, taking into account ESG factors, so environmental, social, and governance. And then, what Rowan really specializes in is the impact investment, which is really looking to generate a financial return, like you said, but then also beyond that is doing something impactful in your society, whether it's serving marginalized, underserved people in housing, affordable housing spaces, whether it's decreasing carbon emissions, and we saw Michael yesterday speaking about that as well. So there must be some sort of element of impact, and that element of impact is generally tied to doing good in society. And the type of investors you get, like Rowan said, can be really diverse, from governments, private equity investors, venture capital investors, and so on and so forth. So then that brings me to the next question is, Sabelo, is, from your experience, how have you positioned your businesses to allow for more impact investment flows into your company? And what could you see now? What are you doing today to try and take advantage of this new and growing sort of investment flow or asset class to position your company? And so when you pitch to investors, there's some sort of interest from them.
Again, yeah, sure. I think what a lot of people tend to miss about pitching to investors is that it's an incredibly long process. The saying goes, it's easier to get a divorce than it is to get somebody off your cap table. So, you want to build a relationship with these folks that you're actually going to, be working with over the long term. So one thing that we found is that when you want to position a business or your business very specifically through impact investors or any investor for that matter, you'd like to, just build a relationship, a rapport with them over a long amount of time. And so I would strongly suggest that I like action steps. I like, some really tangible sort of knowledge that everybody can take home today and start implementing. I'd recommend you shortlist, at least 100 investors in your particular space. Find out what their investment mandate is, and then start, actually ask for permission first, whether you could give them monthly updates on what it is that you're doing. And then, start, a newsletter where you're keeping people informed on the actions that you're actually taking before getting said investment. It's incredibly important that we take the lead before an investor comes to the party and they become an accelerator, for lack of a better term, in what it is that you're doing. So, yeah, that's what I'd like to delve into greater detail of, the mechanics thereof.
Great. So, and then to Colin, from your experience advising sort of very senior leaders across the spectrum, have you seen that these leaders are asking you more and more about positioning themselves to become more impact investor friendly, or as big corporations making impact investment into startups or entrepreneurs who have some sort of impactful element to their business?
Frankly, no. I suppose if you look at the structure of large corporates, it's quite difficult for them, I think, to go into the space in the way that you'd want to. So it's certainly my opinion, but there's a lot of global evidence now that you're seeing better returns for companies that are more purposeful, more impactful, driving especially when they're driving things like sustainable development goals from a positive aspect. So you could take Unilever, for example, as a case study on that, where if you look at their annual performance compared to other companies that are existing in that ecosystem, the simple fact that they've got this idea about driving for sustainable impact across most of their product ranges gives them a huge advantage. And the fact that this is relatively entrenched in the organization, so they base their models around it, gives them a huge advantage. And so they get investors that are going to go and actually, back them. And you could use other examples. You could use, examples like Tesla, for example. Yes, they make cars, but their ultimate aim is to make sustainable transport commonplace. Now, most existing incumbent organizations, especially when they've been around for a long time, 10, 20 years, and they're listed, tend not to be interested in that type of thought process. In essence, they're still profit driven. They're still having to pay out quarterly, annual dividends. They've still got significant pressure from institutional shareholders. So they'll do a certain amount of steps, and they'll use aspects of the sustainable development goals. And I think they're interested and they ask questions about it. But in all honesty, they haven't been able to make that switch from, we are essentially going to move away from short-term profit objectives, Friedman sort of style, to something which is more purposeful. And to be fair to the CEOs in those situations, it's a really, really hard transition to do. And if you think globally, there's really very few case studies or companies that have made that transition. It's one thing if you're a startup, you become a unicorn and your investors are bought on that journey to, from the starting point. Once you've been entrenched for 15, 20 years, your management structures, your board, your institutional investor community, the brand, it's really, really difficult to go and make a significant shift.
Thank you. That's good food for thought, because what Colin mentioned there was sort of the Friedman style of management. So Milton Friedman was a very prominent economist in the 1960s and 1970s in the United States. And in the 1970s, he published a journal article in one of the sort of prominent economics journals in the US, basically stating that the sole purpose of a company is to generate profit for its shareholders. And, that sort of became the mainstay and the bulwark of how companies legitimized increasing short-term returns for shareholders, while employees weren't sort of getting treated well, or the environment was being overlooked, and not much attention was being paid to global warming, carbon emissions, how communities are treated, and things like that. So important things to think about from an institutional perspective. But as it relates to sort of our delegation and to delegates looking to start companies, then let's then turn it back to Rowan. And Rowan, you said that you guys have a sort of, it's like an incubator, but not really. And we have Lerisha here, which is great. Hi, Lerisha. Before we go on to the next question, I just want to introduce Lerisha. So Lerisha is a partner at Baker McKenzie, which is a really sort of well-known international global law firm. She's done a lot of work in the competition and economic space, and also does a lot of work around policy and policy reform in South Africa. So it's great to sort of have her lens from a policy perspective as well. So Lerisha, do you want to sort of give any more introduction to yourself, or you're all set?
Thank you, Zunaid, for that generous introduction, and I apologize for the slight delay in joining, but thank you very much for the indulgence, and it's an absolute pleasure to be a part of this this panel. I mentioned to Zunaid that Brightest Young Minds was something that was always a very aspirant initiative in at least my history. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. Thanks for being here. So Rowan, then circling back to you, from an entrepreneurial perspective, how can we look at, when you're advising entrepreneurs to sort of structure their business plan, the types of investors that they want to get on board? What advice are you giving them, and how can they take advantage of this sort of huge growth in impact investment?
Awesome. So the first bit of advice that I give to a lot of startups, and it's actually the most boring part of the advice, is genuinely just having your documentation, your things like your business registration, and having all of your tax affairs in order and that sort of stuff. It is the boring side of it, but a lot of investors won't even have discussions with a startup if there's not proper financials or financial projections to back up their arguments. So you can be as passionate as you want, but if you don't have the documentation, it can be quite empty. And the next part of it, just to answer on that, and I'm going to actually answer one of the Q&As that was directed, because it actually fits in nicely with this. So the Q&A was, what are some of the key ingredients to balancing impact and returns for a company? In most instances, it tends to be skewed towards one or the other. So part of setting up or starting up your startup is being able to, at the very beginning, start deciding what frameworks you're going to use, what ways you're going to measure it, how you're going to document it, and how you're going to communicate across the impact and the profit that you're going to have. And that also then helps inform what type of funds you're going to target. So for example, some funds have if funds will have a do no harm type mandate, which is that ultimately we're here for profit, but we're not going to invest in like an oil operation or that sort of thing. And so if you are a business that isn't doing harm, but is far more skewed towards being profitable, but also wants to keep impact as part of the model, you've got to go and then target the investors that meet that mandate. If you end up going, the more sort of impact you have as part of your startup's proposition, the more you're going to have to show how that impact takes place. And that's where we step into the realm of impact measurement. And you're going to want to look at things like a theory of change framework, which is how a lot of impact-driven companies show their impact and how it works. And you're going to want to track some key KPIs key performance indicators, and you're going to want to make sure that all of this evidence is there to make it more and more appealing to invest into your startup. A lot of the work that I do is with the SAB Seed Fund, which also works in tandem with the MTN Solution Space at the business school. And even at the very, very seed fund stage, I mean, we grant amounts as small as 20,000 Rand just to get an idea off the ground. But even then, part of the very, very first contract that you sign with that asks you about what are your indicators for success, what is your theory of change framework, what is the impact that you're going to have. And so to answer both questions at the same time, that preparation is very fundamental to approaching impact investing and actually having the impact that your business wants to have.
Great, thank you. That's really good to hear. So really, if you are starting your startup, get your company documents in order, get your financials, and if you don't have financials yet because you're not in revenue, get your financial projections in order. Often, you think, oh, I need to go to a big law firm. That's not the case. There are advisories and law firms out there that will be able to assist you in getting your house in order and getting yourself ready. Because essentially what could happen, and what's speaking to Adrian Saville, who is a very sort of well-known economist in South Africa, if we sort of cultivate a generation of startups that are really thinking critically about impact and how to build impactful businesses that solve solutions contextualized to Africa and South Africa, if you hear, or to your specific country across Africa, you are going to attract the right type of investor who has the right type of mindset, the right type of narrative to help guide you, the right type of contacts, because it's not just about the money. It's also about their networks, their guidance, who they can put you in touch with, what innovative solutions can they bring to bear in your business to help sort of scale and generate more value. And then also probably most importantly is in your second round of funding. So you'll probably get a seed round and then you'll get your Series A. So in your Series A, this is generally a syndicated round, and you'd have a couple of investors coming in and investing in your company. If you have a really strong sort of impact-aware investor at the start, you'd actually see that they'd be able to contact their colleagues across the world and get you a really strong sort of Series A funding in. And those Series A fundings we've seen across Africa are generally north of $5 million. That's sort of the average that we're starting to see. It was just a couple of months ago, Momo got $15 million and Helium Health got $10 million in the Series A funding round. So always think about that. And when Rowan says, look at your KPIs, look at your impact theory, how are you designing that? Those are important things to take note of. So thanks for that. And then Lerisha, beyond just, entrepreneurs operating in a sort of space where they're engaging with investors and trying to build their business. From your perspective then, how can government policy and law play a role in cultivating ecosystems for impact investment? Because I think, if we do have some sort of policies and laws that allow for a framework, that'll allow for, more incentive for people to build upon that.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Zunaid, for the question. And I think it's an excellent one. I think as a starting point, in order for policy and law to play a role, one needs to define what the obstacles are or the impediments are to impact investors and what is being experienced. And I think one needs to be able to then identify what those hurdles are to be able to overcome them through law and through policy. And kind of, the two points that I'd like to make around what the impediments might be. Firstly, imperfect information. Impact investors are, likely to be faced with conditions of imperfect information in certain spaces. and may not be aware of particular opportunities, where gaps lie, and so on. So that could be one hurdle. Also, inflexibility in relation to institutional practices, regulatory practices, and again, investors may experience the complexity in relation to regulatory decision making and so on, which could of course lend itself to being a barrier or a hindrance. The other is kind of governance issues, inadequate governance in legal regimes, uncertainties around rights enforcement, and particular socio-political issues within regimes as well. And so navigating those on the ground require local expertise, personal connections that may not be readily available to investors at large. And so in order to be able to use law and policy, one would in my view need to seek to overcome these types of hurdles. Now, what could one do? The first suggestion I might want to proffer is to strengthen industry infrastructure by implementing a regulatory framework around impact investment. There are some regulatory hurdles. For instance, as Zunaid mentioned, as a competition lawyer, as an antitrust lawyer in South Africa, you have a regulatory body that seeks to prohibit transactions. Now, if impact investment was built in to the considerations that it needed to consider to approve transactions, there may be more appetite to invest on this basis. So maybe perhaps one thought on that. Another would be incentivizing impact investment, and that is, for instance, implementation of, as an example, tax incentives. And governments could utilize these incentives to kind of increase the attractiveness of these kinds of investment activity. Another thought around policy and law is to create a structure around access or more ready access to public funding, and to that will enable again ease of access to impact investment programs and so on. And then just another thought around implementation of ESG reporting standards. Our experience with clients has been that in recent years, there's been this move towards a more stakeholder inclusive approach to corporate reporting requirements, which balances, interests and expectations on all material stakeholders, and public, state-owned and certain private companies already subject to kind of ESG reporting requirements, and perhaps, to facilitate impact investment, it may be worthwhile to develop or extend such reporting requirements to kind of perhaps a wider, more broader range of institutions. So just some thoughts around policy and law and some interventions, Zunaid, that could incentivize it.
Great, thanks, Lerisha. That's really great to hear. I think the main things that I enjoyed from your reflections there was the incentivization of impact investment in Africa and in South Africa, in this case, and then also access to funding. So what are governments doing to incentivize entrepreneurs to build impactful businesses, because they would then obviously get grant funding from government as a sort of form of funding. And then the last thing is also what you mentioned about corporates moving away from a shareholder primacy perspective, where they're only looking at the shareholder as the singular stakeholder to serve, to a more multi-stakeholder perspective. And those stakeholders, as you'll hear in the next sort of panel, which is more sort of in-depth on ESG, is stakeholders beyond just the shareholder, which would be employees, the community, creditors, suppliers, and the environment. which are sort of your established stakeholders in the ESG framework. And then that sort of, I'd like to circle back to Colin, because Colin obviously advises a lot of CEOs in listed companies and gets their perspective, and he appreciates, and I think we all do, the difficult position that some CEOs would be in when they have, shareholders who are demanding profits and CEO's performance is being measured on short-term returns to those shareholders. Colin, is there anything that you've been advising your sort of client base on this space, and is there sort of any way around that you can think of to share with our audience today?
Look, at the end of the day, you're talking about people, and people have emotions. And then if you want people to change their behaviors, whether it's their, whatever strategy that they're setting for their company, you've got to go and really hit them with something which is going to have emotional resonance. And there's two levers which I think work most effectively. The first is you scare the absolute crap out of them. Right, i.e. your business is dying, you're going to lose all the profits, you're going to have to do something fairly fundamental, which is actually quite easy to show many of the incumbent businesses, because there is virtually no industry, actually I can't think of a industry that's not being disrupted and on a path to further disruption of quite significant proportions over the next decade. So that's one lever. On a more positive note, if you can get them in that frame about, okay, Christ, this is a real problem, what do we do? Then you can get them to start thinking about purpose. What is the purpose going to be? What problem are we going to go and solve? And if it doesn't really matter if you call it, impact investing or sustainable development goals, the fundamentals of any product or service, it has to solve a problem. And so if you can get them refocusing on that as if they were a startup again, to say, what problem can we go out there and solve? How can we do this in a way which is running with the times? Then you start to get better ideas being generated. You then may get them to start thinking about developing projects, initiatives, to start to go and try to go and dabble, let's call it dabble, in these spaces over those coming sorts of periods. So that's certainly one thing. The second thing, which is perhaps a little bit over a longer period, is you're seeing investor behavior change as well, right? So if I'm sitting there as the CEO at the moment, my interface is really with the institutional investors for most large listed entities. Now you've got Robin Hood that's coming. Now you've got characters that are making a huge amount of noise, like Elon Musk, changing perceptions about markets and getting massive, Twitter followings, and actually going out to people on Twitter, on social media, to get ideas about what he does with Tesla or some of his other businesses. Here in South Africa, you've got Easy Equities, with the stated goal of democratizing investment, and they do that by fractionalizing and making it a lot easier and cheaper. So as you see more and more people being able to access to invest on a fractionalized basis, and you see it move away from institutional investors just to individuals like us here, on the call, and we start to have our conversations on social platforms, maybe like eToro, or it could be just simply on Facebook or Reddit. You're seeing a shift in terms of the pressure towards organizations, which is blurring the line between I'm an investor and I'm a customer. And so I do think over the longer term, there is quite a lot of hope. It's not just that you've got BlackRock coming out and saying we've got to be more sustainable. You're actually seeing investor behavior starting to get into new companies. CEOs are seeing companies that in theory are identical in the product or the service. So you could do Discovery versus, Momentum or something. Discovery's outperformed, massively, because they've pushed for this purpose of helping people to live longer and more healthily. So they're not unaware of it. They just need some nudges and prods across these different sets of stakeholders to encourage them to have the confidence and the courage to actually start making changes within their own organizations.
Great. That was really good. Going back to sort of the rudimentary aspects of emotions, people, CEOs are people. I love that. And the whole sort of building blocks upward. And then just to follow on.
I just want to, re-highlight that, you can put facts and figures, and you can put business cases together, and you can, my view is that people are driven 100% by emotion, whether you think you're an introvert or an extrovert or an accountant or a left brain. The fact is we're driven by emotion, and we retrofit the numbers in to support what we emotionally want to go and do. So you have to have the numbers, but the first thing that you've got, in anything, is to get the emotion on your side with the audience that you're going to go and enact that sort of change. And if you can do that well, then you will do well.
Great, thank you. And it sort of reminds me of Professor Greg LeBlanc, who's done a lot of sort of business psychology work. Then Colin also mentioned something about BlackRock. So BlackRock's one of the sort of, I think it is the largest asset manager in the world with over $1 trillion under management. And it's headed by a guy called Larry Fink, who's the CEO of BlackRock. And he's sort of been going on this whole tirade of we need to do better, we need to have a multi-stakeholder approach, a long-term approach. But also what's interesting to what Colin says is that, using, we've seen over the pandemic is that, lay people like ourselves are becoming investors and active investors. And we may not invest as much as institutional investors, but we are investing. And we're looking for companies that resonate with us, that share purpose, that share vision. But then, Colin, just to follow on from that then, is there was a summit that I was part of, and the question raised there is that, some of the largest investment funds are pension funds of employees who are employees of companies that don't treat them well. And it's sort of funny, and people are starting to catch on to that. Employees are starting to ask, well, where are you investing my money as an investment fund? They then sort of lay the blame on asset managers and say, well, the asset managers are choosing where to allocate your funds and where you're getting the best returns. How do you see employees and asset managers actually starting to say, well, our actual, source investors are actually asking these types of questions, and then the investment funds are saying to the asset managers, well, you guys need to make a change. Are you seeing any of that in the market at the moment?
I'm not. It doesn't mean it's not happening, but I will say it's really hard, right? Because if you think about the structure of a pension fund and how rigid it is, if you go outside of the frameworks that are set, as the trustees and the directors that oversee it, you're going to go to jail. So don't expect pension funds to be able to change particularly quickly in their allocation models. I mean, for example, if you've set up a risk-based approach and you've got to have a certain split of bonds and stocks, you might want to go into impact investing, right? But that doesn't really exist as a risk category, because impact investing could be anything. There's really low-level impact investments. You can do this really high-level ones. So I think they've got a really challenging journey to open up to offer staff choice in terms of where their money goes. And, if you think about, a typical company pension scheme, the whole idea is you don't give your staff choice. You're actually really trying to go and incentivize them to join your company by making a company contribution and have it all set up, wonderfully, and you don't have to go and actually think about it. I suppose on the basis, firstly, that you're legally obligated to at a certain size, and if you do give your employees choice, 99 times out of 100, they're probably not going to invest anyway. In all honesty, the more choice you get, the less that you're likely to do it. So I don't see that as the path, in all honesty, which is going to radically shift the dial. I see it more on the private retail investment side, starting to drive. And you're seeing that because private retail investments as a percentage has increased radically over the last decade. I think we've gone from it being roughly 5 or 10% of the overall investments. This is in the US 10, 15 years ago. It's up to over 20% now. And obviously with COVID, that has increased again dramatically. So expect that to continue rising to 30% plus over the next 5 or 6 years.
Fascinating. Thanks for those reflections, Colin. Really insightful and very practical.
I'm actually hoping someone will tell me I'm wrong on that one, because obviously it slows it down. I'm hoping Lerisha comes in and says, actually, there's this huge policy change, and the likes of Benitez and all these big players are doing radical shifts, but I've not seen it so far.
Great. Well, good. I think we'll circle back to that. To that question. The one question I wanted to ask Sabelo, because he's had sort of direct interaction with investors as a startup, is how controlling do you see investors on your sort of business vision and mission? Because ultimately, especially with venture capital funds, they have a 7 to 10 year horizon at which they want to exit and obviously generate a return. The idea is a 10x return, and that 10x return then obviously satisfies their limited partners and investors. But what is your experience with investors and what they want to draw out of you? Do you have a say at the table? Can you control the fact that you still want to do something impactful while still generating a financial return? It may not be as big as it could be if you sort of disregarded environmental regulations or took a lot of shortcuts. What is your view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the things I really wanted to touch on, the fact that being an impact or impactful company doesn't mean that you're not a cash generating one. They're not mutually exclusive. So, one of the things that, I've seen, running two companies, I had way too much free time. So I decided to pursue an MSc in finance with Edinburgh Business School. And you find even in the text there that impact investment is profitable. So I think my experience is relatively biased in that I'm hitting my numbers. So, I pretty much run the show. It's pretty sweet. And I'd like to share a metric that every VC kind of looks at. And that's triple, and then double. If you do the maths, you triple your business over the first 3-4 years. Thereafter, you double it. You'll get to unicorn status. If you're hitting those numbers, everybody loves you. When it starts to get a little bit iffy, that's when it's a little bit tough. So the underlying investment thesis that we came with was such that, the business is very, very, it's impactful, but it's incredibly profitable, not just in the short term, but rather in the long term. If you're able to eloquently communicate that and demonstrate it in reality, then everybody smiles. Just to touch back on, employees getting involved, through their pension funds. I'm a Solidity developer. A lot of people are talking about Web3, but very few people are building. So I love building on the Ethereum network. I'd like more people to get involved. Hit me up. I'll share some free courses that, can get you really stuck in. If anything, at least the average salary is $150,000 a year. Maybe that's enticing. But with building on an Ethereum network or a blockchain network for that matter, you could create DAOs, digital autonomous organizations. Of course, the legislation has to catch up in order for us to fully leverage that technology. But it can be done. It's just a matter of having a bias for action. Less talk, more delivery. And if you hit your numbers, as long as you hit your numbers, you run the show.
Thanks for that, Sabelo. So basically, investors are looking at the numbers, but taking it back, do you feel that investors also, or you can tell investors, look, well, I want to do these impactful things and this is the purpose of my business, or do you feel them starting to control that purpose and that direction?
Well, if it's communicated right from the outset, if your why is that compelling and you're able to just make sure everybody knows what they're getting themselves into, of course, that is something that you ascertain during your courting period with the said investor. You can very quickly see who you want on your cap table and who you don't want on your cap table. It's one of those, I really like what Colin said, you're dealing with people at the end of the day. We've never taken a cent of grant money with the fintech. It's all been commercial investors. So there's an appetite. If you position your business correctly and and you consistently execute, then wow, it's not really rocket science, but it can be a bit tough to execute. I think it's very important that we get it right from the beginning, that everybody knows what to expect. You did mention that it's a 7-year horizon, and yeah, gosh, there's a lot of research to support that. Case study after case study after case study, especially if you're able to track where everything is sourced. The likes of Apple, for instance, and Nike and Reebok as well, when they were using child labor, that didn't do well for the numbers. So, that's the sort of thing you want to bring up when you're speaking to an investor or a customer, most importantly. They'll realize that it's great PR for their brand and everybody wins. And that way you hit your numbers and everybody loves you.
Great, thanks, Sabelo. So that also circles back to what Rowan was saying about having a sort of impact investment thesis. If you need to know more about what an impact investment thesis is, it's not just a one size fits all. It really is particular to the type of industry, the type of vertical you want to get involved in, and then also building on from that impact investment thesis, the KPIs you're looking to hit. But like we heard yesterday, startups often go through iterations and often have to pivot along the way. So it's not a sort of straight track either.
Look, a hypothesis, just a quick, because you're talking about investing, and I'm really curious what the other panel members think about this. I think there is more money out there than you're ever going to need, right? My view is that if you go out with your product or service and you are structured enough to just keep on going, and your product, your idea is good enough, you are going to find an investor somewhere, because we've got this weird trend, over the last, couple of decades, where you've seen just so much money to go into so few hundreds of people. They don't know what to do with it, right? And many of them are wanting to go and give it back. So all of them are setting up family trusts and investment funds to go and try to support entrepreneurs. Now, obviously, a lot of this is sitting over in the US, right? So, for example, you've got 1K1V, which is a set of families that want to invest through to support African, businesses. And I keep hearing the stories, and I don't think these unique stories of the people that have gone and set up. Let's use Easy Equities, right? Easy Equities, when Charles Savage was asking for support to go and back that initiative, not once was he asked by the major contributors how much financial P&L he was going to go and make. He sold them on the story that this was a purposeful company that was going to help people in South Africa invest into equities. So I don't want to say that every investor is going to be in that space. Maybe 95% of them are still very rigid, very financially focused, and actually in South Africa a little bit, but behind the times on a different model to what you'd see in Silicon Valley. But even if there's just 1% who are fitting into this caricature I'm giving, that is a hell of a lot of people around the globe if you can find them and access them and get networked to them who may well be willing to go and support your particular initiative. So I'll pause there. But to me, I don't think getting capital is the biggest issue that startups have nowadays.
Rowan and Sabelo, maybe you guys want to add to that. And I think I agree with Colin to an extent that, capital is not the biggest issue. It's defining your purpose and business model.
Absolutely. I completely agree with that. I mean, you'd be shocked and horrified just how much money is out there, literally from family offices, endowments, pension funds, because now pension funds are starting to invest directly in these entities. It's just mind-boggling. I think that the difficulty is, and I used to hate it when I would hear that earlier on. I was like, goodness gracious, where is this money that everybody's talking about? I think it's a matter of building relationships. I think you mentioned it, Zunaid, that above and beyond just getting cash from a particular investor, you build very strong relationships. And you'd be horrified just how much cash is not only seeking alpha, but seeking deployment. It can't just, sit and gather dust, no pun intended. So I strongly recommend that, these conversations to continue offline as well, because I'd like to share very specific and direct ways in which you can access this capital.
Great, thanks. Rowan, any thoughts there?
Yeah. So it's something that I also found interesting. I mean, I've spoken to some investing groups, for example, Old Mutual. They've got a fund called Masizizane, which they've been struggling to deploy. The government, CIFA, has a fund that is specifically for entrepreneurs with disabilities, and they have got 60 million rand in that fund that they haven't been able to deploy. I think one of the things about it, so this actually answers two questions in the Q&A around how do you discover this, or how do you find these things? The thing about it is that it's really, really complex. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations. So a year ago, I tried to put together, I was working with Old Mutual on a startup called SME Go, where we were trying to put on all of the types of funding onto one platform. And as we started building, we realized that there's actually so much more that exists out there than we could ever properly capture. But what's important is to be able to find almost the tribe of investors, or the grouping of people that might support someone like you. So for example, with the Masizizane Fund, they focus on Black-owned businesses, but that are in their supply chain. And so if you provide stuff to Old Mutual, if you are selling, for example, there's one group called Lerisha Cookies, which is a social enterprise that employs about 90 women, and they supply to Old Mutual like some cookies and stuff like that, but they're able to access funding because Old Mutual has a fund for people within their supply chain. And so there is no, very sadly, there is no specific one database where everything's at, but you build up by following organizations on LinkedIn, attending events like this and getting to know people like Sabelo and Lerisha and Colin, like getting to see that landscape, and you build it out. It may take time, but you can engage your interest from way earlier on. So, for example, I know that at some point I want to work, I really want to start a startup in the future about focusing on housing and focusing on specifically inclusive housing. So already now I'm starting to follow funds, starting to follow organizations, starting to follow groups like all the way from Indifuno Kwazi, all the way through to groups that are specifically investing in social housing, and you build that ecosystem up for yourself. So the answer to where do I find funding is not here's a specific place, but here's the ecosystem that you need to approach, engage with, meet people, follow things, follow newsletters, and keep up to date with the industry. That's the best way to access and to get to know impact investors and investors in general.
I think that was great, and Colin, thanks for putting that the question out there. I think it was received some good responses, and it sort of circles back to what Paul Kirsten said yesterday about putting yourself in a space where you can collaborate, meet people, engage, and you have to take it a step further. Sabelo and Rowan both say that, you know, look at your vertical that you're operating in, look at the industry you're operating in, look at what you're looking to achieve, and there are funds, there are venture capital funds that actually have a research thesis and portfolio companies that follow that research thesis, whether it be in sustainable housing, whether it be in agriculture and agri-tech. So you've got to really do your research and start to get yourself into those ecosystems. And you may find that the more you get deeper into those ecosystems, your idea starts to shift and change and becomes a little bit more robust and more attractive to investors, which goes to Colin's point about actually being really a sort of attracting people through the purpose of your company, and you'll actually see yourself being selling your company very easily, which is important. Then that sort of brings me, guys, we've got 7 minutes left, and I haven't even touched the Q&A. We've got 11 open questions, and I think the first question I want to ask is, you know, what are the frameworks that you'd look at as a preferred impact investment frameworks that one can look at to sort of position their startup? Rowan, I'll let you answer that.
So I'm going to be very brief with this because of time, but one of the favorites in the industry in impact investing is the theory of change. It's a whole framework that looks at what is your input. So what are you doing as a company? What's the output? What's the result of that? What's the outcome that comes from your output? And then how does that reach your goal? And so a theory of change is one of the most important frameworks. There's lots of them, and a lot of different funds specify how they want to measure things in their own way. But just understanding your theory of change is a great component to understanding your impact.
Perfect, thanks. And then the other question was, hi, Rowan, thank you for those insights. To what extent, if any, has COVID-19 influenced the way impact investment will be going forward? Example, will there be a significant shift towards healthcare-related startups? I think that's an interesting question. I guess we'll get to the panel.
So I'll dive into that one very quickly as well. So I think with impact investing, it's probably accelerated it a lot. There's obviously become a lot more urgent need, a lot more awareness of how globally connected we are. But one of the interesting ways in which it's been accelerated is actually the fact that we can all attend events and network globally now. So I was in an event 2 weeks ago. We were speaking to University Impact, who's an impact investing fund from the US, and they've decided they want to start putting some funding into SA, but they've never even been here, which I find fascinating. And so that global reach means that we could attend conferences, we could have discussions on impact, globally now. So just to put a direct answer to that question, the impact of COVID-19 has been massive, both on the investment front, but also on the networking and people that are able to get involved from every remote corner. You don't have to be at the Graduate School of Business to attend a Graduate School of Business event anymore.
Great, thanks. And then that takes me just to another question is, how do we define as Africans impact? I mean, impact could be slightly different depending on the context that you're in. Lerisha, maybe you have some insight for us when you're advising companies on ESG and impact? Are they aware of transformation as an impact measurement in South Africa, for example, or other types of impact measurements that we could utilize? And that sort of goes to some Reedy's question about how do you best measure impact, but I think also contextualizing it as well.
Yeah, thanks, Zunaid. I mean, of course, there's some analogous understandings of what impact means around the world, but certainly, local nuances must and do play a role in relation to kind of measurement. I mean, as a competition lawyer, before, the South African Competition Authority, the types of transactions that we work on and the types of hurdles that one needs to cross over here are incredibly different from those in other parts of the world. Here we've got transformation, as you know, as one of them. It's economic deconcentration, and someone did put a question up around monopolies and barriers to entry in markets, and certainly that is one of the overriding policy considerations that our authorities look at in South Africa. So certainly we are, the local nuance plays a role in measurement and factors in to measurement assessments and so on, and that's why I think that regulation needs to come into play to build this into kind of domestic regimes. But I'll keep it short. I know that time is running out.
Great, thank you. Also insightful answer there. The other question was from Mokete, who asks, how will impact be measured and regulated? How do startups position themselves to win in this regard? I think we've gone over that, but maybe I could sort of open that to the floor. Anyone have any views that they'd like to add? We still have, there's a wealth of information we haven't even touched on, but anyone want to give a bit more, sort of shed a bit more light on how do startups position themselves to win in terms of impact investment? We had some really great advice from Rowan, but anyone else have anything else to share on that front?
Yeah, I'd really like to give us a bit of a stab, because there's something that I spoke to my co-founder yesterday about, and I said I'll definitely speak about this. Folks, gender lens investing is something that's real. In Africa, the single thing that can change a lot of people's livelihoods is by getting women in the workplace, starting businesses, etc. So literally, if there's anything you remember about anything I've said, folks, get a diverse team. You'll be having different conversations to your competitors. It's a competitive advantage. It's not necessarily lowering the bar, it's widening the gate. So gender lens investing is a thing. It's the easiest and quickest way to change livelihoods exponentially of people on this continent. So let's do our bit.
Great, and I can sort of say that from experience. I was at a summit 3 years ago now in California, where ESG is a very prominent thing, but diversity on the board was a big question that's being asked, and gender parity as well. And there are investors who are actually looking at how diverse companies are and preferring more diverse companies as opposed to less diverse companies. And a study came out of Stanford, which actually showed that the more diverse a board is and reflective of a demographic, better sort of outcomes that they've had. And this was a quantitative and a qualitative study by Stanford, which is obviously a reputable institution. Guys, I think that leaves us at 11 o'clock sharp. We could talk about this stuff for hours. I think we really did well with the time we had. And we also have Orny Patton-Power, who I think, Rowan, you probably work with her at the Bertha Institute. She's going to be talking to you guys, doing a workshop on impact investing, and really taking you guys through that, and that'll be for an hour. So if you guys have any other questions, I'm sorry we couldn't get to them. We will have Orny on a workshop sort of structure at 1 o'clock. But right now, I'd just like to thank this illustrious team and the sort of really good feedback we got from everyone. Rowan, Colin, Lerisha, Sabelo, thanks so much for your time. It's really been great. And we hope that next year we'll see you at some of our in-person events. I've been saying to the delegation that we are partnering with Workshop 17, and we are going to have some in-person events next year. It'd be great to have your guys' wisdom and thoughts, and also just the ability to network and interact with alumni of BYM and new delegates that are coming through next year. Thanks so much for your time.